Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking into a case out of Georgia, and it's pretty disturbing, honestly, so buckle up because this one really gets under your skin. We're working with excerpts from the Law & Crime podcast episode on this one, and we've got some news coverage of the sentencing, too.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those cases that just makes you think like, wow, there's some real darkness out there, even in places you'd never expect.
Exactly. So we're talking about William and Zachary Zulock. On the surface, they seem to be living the American dream. You know, the whole 9 yards upscale home in Loganville, good jobs. William was in government and Zachary worked in banking. They were active on social media, even had that picture of themselves in those Love My Family shirts with the rainbow, you know, the ones. Oh yeah, trying to project that perfect image, right? And that's part of what makes this whole thing so unsettling, because behind that carefully constructed facade, they were doing some really awful things to their two adopted sons who were just 10 and 12 years old. It's tough to even talk about, but I think it's important to try to understand how something like this could even happen. The sources actually go into detail about how the investigation started with a tip about a totally different guy, Hunter Lawless. He was downloading child pornography.
Right, and Lawless eventually admitted he got that material from Zachary Zulock. And here's the really disturbing part. He revealed that Zulak had offered his sons to him for sexual abuse.
So it wasn't just possession, it was active participation in creating this horrific content. It gets worse. Investigators found a ridiculous amount of evidence at the Zulak's home, 7 terabytes. To put that in perspective, we're talking about 3,000 hours of video, or like 3.5 million photos.
Yeah, and what gets to me is they meticulously documented everything. They had cameras set up all over their house, not for security, but to record the abuse.
It's like they wanted to keep a record of their crimes. They'd brag about it in texts and on social media, even admit to it after it happened, almost like they were proud of it.
It really gives you a glimpse into the mind of an abuser, that complete lack of remorse, the distorted sense of morality. They even tried to market their abuse online using coded language like lollipops to refer to the content. It's just chilling.
It makes you wonder, how do these networks even work? Is it all happening on the dark web? How are law enforcement agencies even supposed to keep up with this kind of stuff?
It's definitely an uphill battle, and new technologies are making it even tougher. We're seeing more and more AI-generated content that depicts child abuse, so there's no actual child involved in the creation of the material, making it even harder to detect and prosecute.
That's terrifying. We'll have to dig into that more later on. But for now, let's get back to the Zulak's case. The charges against them were serious aggravated sodomy, child molestation, sexual exploitation of children, even pandering.
They both ended up receiving sentences of 100 years without the possibility of parole. It really shows you how seriously the justice system takes these crimes.
100 years, that's a powerful message. What kind of impact do you think a sentence like that has, both for potential offenders and for the victims?
I think for potential offenders, it sends a very clear message that these crimes will not be tolerated. Society is drawing a hard line. And while no amount of punishment can ever truly undo the harm that's been done to the victims, knowing that their abusers will never be free might offer some small sense of justice and maybe even closure.
It's unimaginable what those boys went through and what they're still going through. Investigators have said that they've shown resilience, but there's no way to ignore the lasting psychological effects that they'll have to deal with.
Absolutely. And that's where we need to shift our focus. Because even though the legal case is closed, the journey for these young survivors is just beginning. The trauma of child sexual abuse can have a profound and lasting impact on their lives.
So let's talk about that. What are some of those long-term effects, and how can we as a society better support these victims?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that we'll unpack in the next part of our deep dive. Picking up where we left off, let's talk more about those long-term psychological effects of child sexual abuse. It's a heavy topic, but if we really want to support survivors, we have to understand the impact, you know?
For sure.
Yeah.
We've talked about those boys and how resilient they seem to be.
Yeah.
But obviously that doesn't mean they won't face some serious challenges as they heal and try to move on. So what are some of the issues they might have to deal with?
Well, the thing is, trauma can manifest in a lot of different ways. We often see survivors struggling with things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, you know, the usual suspects. But they might also have nightmares, flashbacks, even physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, things like that.
Like their whole sense of safety and security has just been ripped away.
Exactly. And without the right support and intervention, those early experiences can have ripple effects throughout their entire lives.
Yeah.
You know, it can affect their education, their careers, their relationships, even how they parent their own kids if they decide to have a family.
So it's not just about coping with that immediate trauma. It's about stopping those long-term consequences from taking root. What does that support look like? What kind of help is available for these young survivors?
Therapy is essential, like absolutely crucial. Trauma-informed therapy can equip them with coping mechanisms, help them process those emotions in a healthy way, and start rebuilding that sense of self-worth.
Are there specific types of therapy that work best for survivors of child sexual abuse?
There are several approaches that have shown some real promise. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, can help them challenge those negative thought patterns and develop healthier ways of thinking and behaving. And then there's play therapy, which can be really helpful for younger children because it lets them express those emotions and experiences through play. And then there's EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's been pretty effective in helping survivors process traumatic memories.
So it sounds like there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about finding the right type of therapy or combination of therapies for each individual child.
Right. And it goes beyond just therapy. These kids need a support system, a network of people they can trust and lean on. Family, friends, teachers, even members of the community can all play a role.
We hear a lot about the importance of breaking the silence when it comes to child sexual abuse. How can we as individuals and as a community create a safer space for survivors to come forward and ask for help?
I think it starts with education. We need to be talking about this issue openly and honestly. Parents should have those age-appropriate conversations with their kids about body safety and healthy boundaries. We need to teach them how to spot inappropriate behavior and give them the confidence to speak up if something feels wrong. And as adults, we need to be vigilant, pay attention to the signs of abuse and be willing to report any suspicions to the authorities.
It's about changing the whole culture from one of shame and secrecy to one of open communication and support. We need to make crystal clear that it's never the child's fault and there's no shame in seeking help.
Couldn't agree more. And it's not just about protecting children from abuse. It's also about preventing people from becoming abusers in the first place. And that brings us back to the psychology of these offenders.
Yeah, we talked about the Zulaks and how brazen they were, that lack of remorse, the way they seemed to justify their actions. Is there any way to identify potential abusers before they hurt a child? Are there any warning signs we should be looking out for?
That's a tough one, and there's no easy answer. As we mentioned earlier, pedophilia, the sexual attraction to prepubescent children is often a factor. But not every pedophile becomes an abuser. There's usually a whole bunch of risk factors at play.
So what are some of those risk factors?
Well, there's a history of childhood trauma or abuse, substance abuse, personality disorders, cognitive distortions that minimize or justify their actions. It's often this perfect storm of vulnerabilities and messed up thinking that leads to these horrible acts.
It's scary to think that someone you might know, someone you might even trust, could be harboring these thoughts and tendencies.
It's a hard truth to swallow. And it really highlights how important prevention efforts are. We need to be investing in programs that address these risk factors, providing support for those who might be struggling with these urges, and creating a culture where seeking help for these issues is encouraged, not stigmatized.
Okay, so we've covered the impact on the victims, the importance of therapy, and support the psychology of the abusers, and the need for prevention. But what about the community's role in all of this? Where do they fit in?
That's a great question, and one that we'll dive into in the final part of our deep dive.
We've been talking about this horrible case with William and Zachary Zulock and the abuse they inflicted on their adopted sons. It's easy to get caught up in all that darkness, but I think it's time to shift gears a bit and think about what we can do to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening in the first place. We touched on the community's role, so I think it's worth digging into that a little deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. Focusing on prevention and community action is so important. It's easy to think, well, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a cop. What can I actually do? But honestly, everyone has a role to play. We all live in a community, right? And we can all do something to make it a safer environment for kids.
Okay, so break it down for me. What can people actually do to make a difference?
Well, first things first, educate yourself. Learn about the signs of child sexual abuse, both the physical and the behavioral indicators. There are tons of resources online from places like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They can really help you recognize those red flags.
So it's about being more aware of what's going on around us, not just with our own kids, but with all the children in our community.
Exactly. And if something seems off, don't just ignore it. Trust your gut. It's better to report something and be wrong than to keep quiet and let the abuse continue. You might be the only one who notices that something's wrong.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It really does take a village. We all have to look out for each other's kids.
Absolutely. And that responsibility goes beyond just recognizing and reporting abuse. We can also support survivors in our community. Sometimes it's as simple as listening to them without judgment, believing their stories, and encouraging them to get professional help.
Right. We've talked about breaking that silence around child sexual abuse. So how can we create a space where survivors feel safe coming forward?
I think it all comes down to being open and honest. We need to challenge that stigma and shame that surrounds abuse so that survivors don't feel like they have to suffer alone. Educate your kids about body safety, teach them about healthy boundaries, give them the power to speak up if something's not right.
And for those who've already been through it, it's about making sure they feel supported and understood. It's about access to good therapy support groups and resources that can help them heal and move on.
Exactly. And it's not just about individuals stepping up. Communities as a whole need to invest in prevention programs and support services. Schools can implement curriculum on body safety and healthy relationships. Faith-based organizations can offer counseling and support groups. Local governments can fund child advocacy centers. There's a lot that can be done.
This is where the Zulak case really hits home. On the surface, they seem like any other family. It's a wake-up call that this can happen anywhere to anyone.
Chilling, isn't it? It just shows you how important community-wide awareness and action really are. We can't just assume that someone else is taking care of it. We all have to step up and do our part to protect kids.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a sense of hope and empowerment. Yeah, the topic of child sexual abuse is heavy and disturbing. But by understanding it, being aware of the warning signs, and taking action in our own communities, we can make a real difference. Every child deserves to grow up feeling safe, loved, and protected, and it's up to all of us to make that happen.